Hi, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah with the Midwest Writing Center, and today I am all alone to talk about reading outside your comfort zone. I think this is probably not the most exciting. I do think it's pretty exciting. I think it's probably not my most popular topic to date, but I think it's really, really important. Let me rewind. If you're new here, what's going to happen is I'm going to address the topic of the day. Then I'm going to tell you new exciting happenings at the Midwest Writing Center. Then we're going to do a 5-minute free write at the very end. Usually that free write is related to the topic du jour. So I guess you've got that to look forward to. Okay, now we talk a lot in the literary community about reading. One of the standby predictable pieces of advice for writers is to read widely, read everything. And that's amazing advice. I stand by it, and so does everyone else. People much more educated, important, famous, talented than me also give this advice because it's the best advice. If you want to be a better writer, you need to read, period. I want to say this is because I like to generally include all media in art talks, right? And I want to say that that's true of all artists. Consume all the art you can. This, of course, is going to be much more specific to writers today, but I think as a general piece of advice, it holds just as important, true across the board. Consume all of the art that you can, particularly if you're an artist. Granted, I was gonna say, is consuming this kind of art when you're this kind of artist going to, yes, it's always going to benefit you as a human and as an artist. Every new kind of art that you can consume is going to benefit you. I'd also say, the similarities in art crossing genres are so many more than there are differences. And we separate them. We put up these funny boundaries about like what is music and what is visual art. You're like, well, music can be heard and visual art can be seen, but like the written word can be seen and heard, right? So that's a rant for another day. I have a lot of feelings about genre. But it was an online reading last night, and I am not one to close my eyes. I usually really need to see the speaker. But I did. I took a long blink or something, and the reader was so musical that I actually laughed. I was like, yes, what I've been saying all along is true, which, like, obviously poetry is rhythm. It is sound, but also like it's not obvious. Right. Moving on to the actual content of this show. So why does it matter to read outside your comfort zone? I'm going to address the rest of the show as though I'm definitely speaking to writers exclusively, and readers exclusively, because today's topic is reading outside the comfort zone. And I hope you're out there like thinking about how this can apply to other art forms. And you know what? I hope you'll participate. I hope you'll tell me what they are. I hope that you'll give input and even come on the show. Let's talk about doing this with other media. But today I'm going to be pretty single-minded, or I'm going to try. So why does it matter to read outside the comfort zone? A lot of reasons. The biggest one I think would be just having a holistic experience of the world makes you a better writer. But it makes you a better person too, which is the biggest one, but it's also the vaguest. Like, yeah, it's good for your brain health. There are really cool studies out there that show, doing a routine thing differently is really good for brain health. Some scientists somewhere talk about how you create new paths, like literal new wrinkles in your brain when you say walk a different path to get where you're going, or drive a different path. And they've done studies where they watch the brain patterns of taxi drivers who use GPS versus who either use a map or their memory. Granted, that's like a very new thing, having GPS, so it's probably mostly old timers who don't need it or who use maps. But all the same, we see that there's much more activity and much more flexibility in the brains of people who try new things, or use maps, I guess. And brain health, of course, matters. If I need to tell you why brain health matters, we're going to be here a long time. I am not a neuroscientist. And I think we all know that brain health matters. And particularly if we want to make better words, we want to read better words. My brain health. If we want to make better words, we want to have better brain health. Another reason, you want to expand your abilities and you want to expand your horizons as an artist. If we're always reading things that are similar, we're limiting how much we can do. It's a bit like, if you never leave your neighborhood that you were born in, you're never going to see people who aren't from the neighborhood you were born in, or who speak a different language, or unless you live in a cool neighborhood that has many languages going on. Probably most of us do. But you're not going to see different kinds of houses. You're not going to see different kinds of trees. You're not going to see different kinds of education, etc. So if you're only putting the same thing in your brain, the same things are mostly going to come out. But it also expands the number of topics you can talk about, the number of ways you can express, and this goes, there's so much to this reading outside your comfort zone. And I'm going to focus on two main comfort zones, one being genre, one being topic, but there's so much more to it because let's say I only read fiction. Well, there's this is true of any genre. There's a whole world of fiction out there, and the narrative styles can be different, and the narrative voice can be different, and themes and all the other literary jargon. I'm just looking at the books that I've prepared to show you here. The voices, meaning in this context, when I say voice, I mean the way the words are put together and the consistency of language throughout the book. That varies so wildly from book to book. So just reading fiction isn't limiting you necessarily in terms of how language is used, but it is limiting you to fiction's really the worst example I could have given. But it is limiting you all the same to some, in some ways, to perspective. You can have a wide array, you can have an infinite array of perspectives demonstrated in fiction, but if you are limiting yourself to fiction, then you're limiting yourself. My notes today are just bullets, and that's usually how my notes are, but these are just really not detailed. I always say because, or, and if, and that's where I'm trailing off. I used to, here's what's really happening. I used to basically exclusively read fiction, and that's true. I didn't read nonfiction. I didn't read poetry. I didn't even read genre fiction. It was just literary and contemporary fiction. There's some YA sprinkled in, I would still call that contemporary most of the time. There's not a whole lot of classic children's lit. There's some discussion we can get into there about what children's lit is, and that's a topic that I really love and should probably talk about sometime, because I can talk about it endlessly. But I would primarily say that children's lit just falls under the contemporary fiction category. So I know, is my point. I know that only reading fiction is a very limiting experience, and I can't totally put my finger on why, right? Because it's not like there's some rule to fiction that says it can only be one way. We know that fiction varies probably the most of the three genres, right? Fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, which, if you've watched me before, you know I don't really buy into genre. Right, because fiction can tell true stories, and fiction can give you facts. Fiction can be from any perspective, and it can use any voice, but it's still not the be all end all of literature. And importantly, this is something that I didn't really know or think about before I worked in a bookstore, which is silly because I spent my whole life in bookstores and I spent my whole life in libraries. But if you go into a bookstore, the fiction section is the smallest. I mean, unless, okay, the poetry section or the comic section is probably smaller, but I would say that comics go along with either fiction or nonfiction or poetry. There is comic poetry out there. But the fiction section is dwarfed, absolutely dwarfed by nonfiction. There are so many subcategories of nonfiction that just don't exist within fiction. Within fiction, we tend to get 2, 3 categories, and one is literary fiction and one is speculative fiction. Speculative fiction, if you're not familiar with that term, is sci-fi fantasy. Basically, every once in a while you'll get like a mystery section, which then encompasses like thrillers and cozy mysteries and horror, but usually that's too much delineation for a bookstore. It would be interesting if we thought about, and this isn't some advice I'm going to give in a moment, but it would be interesting if we thought about books the same way we think about movies, or even the same way we think about music. But because I actually don't really buy into genre, it's not an argument I'm willing to make, because like I really, really love music, and I have friends who know genres of music, and I'll be like, oh, this is rock, and they'll be like, actually this is I don't know. I'm already drawing a blank. This is a black shoe metal. I'm sorry, black shoegaze, and I just, make that face that I'm making right now, stare blankly at them because, well, actually, I do know what shoegaze is, and I probably wouldn't call it rock. There are so many genres, is my point. So many genres within any category of music, of movies, of television, of obviously like paintings, visual art, right? Because not all visual art is paintings. And so the same is true of literature. But you go to a movie store and it's the movie store. Do those exist? The fiction section is much larger than the nonfiction section, right? The movie store, good golly, I hope you know what a movie store is, dear audience. The movie store has maybe a small documentary section, but then it's got action adventure, it's got comedy, it's got children's, it's got award winners, fantasy, and we just don't separate books that way. So that's a cool thing to do, and I recommend doing that actually, just for this exercise of getting outside your comfort zone. You never know what you're missing is another reason that this is important. You just don't. I'm one of those people who is moved more by like mood when I'm in a bookstore or a library, and I wander and something grabs my attention, and that's what I go with. I don't really know how other people work. I know that a lot of people in the world just grab a book. Shouldn't be grabbing from this side. These are my example books. Okay, here's one. I know some people just grab a book and sit down and read it, and it's easy for them. I personally really need to be moved by a book. It needs to call me. I don't know what that's about. I know I'm not alone. I don't know what that's about. But the point is, if that's the only way I pick out my books, and it's not, I try really hard to not let that be the only way I pick out my books. I'm never going to know what I'm missing because I'm the person making these decisions, right? Or whatever inside me I let choose is the only person making these decisions, and I can't think outside of myself, which is why reading outside of my comfort zone is important so that I can expand the way that I think. I think I already said this, and I will go into slightly more detail about it in a little bit, but expanding your horizons as a human being, as a reader, will allow you and will push you, and it'll be seamless. You may not even notice. It will expand your abilities as a writer, which is really important. I mean, I'm not going to out anybody, but there's this author that I used to just really, really love, read everything he wrote. And I got to like the 4th or 5th book of his that I had ever read. And I was like, man, these all sort of follow a pattern. There's something like very similar about all of his books. And I met him after having read, however many books he had out, because I had read them all by this point. It was at a book launch, so I guess I hadn't read the new one. And he said he doesn't read. And it from there, it seemed clear. Of course, he doesn't read. All of his books remind you of all of his other books. There's no new information coming in, which is really interesting and horrible. I still think he's an excellent writer, but I'm much less impressed with his work because my suspicions, right, that all of his books were pretty close to the same, were true. There's nothing new in there. Okay. Moving on from that, I kind of wish I'd grabbed his books, but that would have been weird after I said all that. Because one of the things that I'm going to talk about is the kinds of horizons that we want to be expanding. And he's a really good author for folks who don't read in general. So that's something, right? A lot of the times what we're trying to do is help someone read who's not a reader. And I think that the only thing we really need to do with that is look at their interests, right? Which is why the analogy with movies was important to me. What kind of movies do they watch? What kind of TV do they watch? If they're, it's not a flawless method. Like for me, I don't watch dramas on television, but I'll read books that are serious, right? A better way of saying that is I basically only watch sitcoms, but I don't read a whole lot of funny books. And I love to read funny books. I like laughing. But my experience of TV is different from my experience in literature. But that's a really great entry point. If somebody's particularly interested in comedy or action, then you can do that. You can just say, here's an action book. Read away. But I think that we gathering here as writers together in this moment are probably thinking more about ourselves. And so, of course, you can think of yourself like that. am I reading the same types of things that I watch on TV? And if not, then that broadens your horizons right there. And if so, maybe you can make that transition via audio visual media, but you don't have to. I mean, they feel very different to me. Granted, or I hope that you note, I didn't say I only watch comedy movies. It's television that I won't watch dramas for, and that's I'm missing out. But mentally, where I am, when I sit down to watch TV is just not my medium. When I sit down to watch TV, I'm generally doing it to work as kind of like a palate cleanser for the day. If I sit down to watch a movie, I am making a 2-hour commitment to an experience. It just happens that my relationship with television is just not what my relationship with literature is. Plenty of people are the opposite, or have different ways of those intersecting. But that is a way to sort of discern what fresh categories you may be into. My spouse is really into horror, and so if there's a horror, when he wanted me to get into horror movies, he did that with horror comedy. So you can do the same thing with books, obviously. Okay, so I made the goal for myself in 2020. It was my New Year's resolution. I did not know I would have so much time on my hands when I made this resolution. I wanted to read things I'd never read before. And at the time, I didn't call it reading outside my comfort zone. I just, I worked at a bookstore, and I just went up to my coworkers. By the way, people who work at bookstores love books. Go figure. You can ask your librarian or your bookstore. In fact, I know at least the Rock Island Public Library has a recommendation program where the librarians will curate books for you based on what you're into, which is, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. Yeah, no, I'll just go there. If you are having trouble picking a book for yourself that is outside of your comfort zone, librarians and booksellers are amazing resources. Librarians in particular, but people who love books. And part of that is going to be, you're going to find the place where you intersect, and they're going to help move you in a direction that you haven't yet gone. I want to know what you love reading. And let's say you love Chuck Palahniuk, and you want to read something, you want to go outside your comfort zone in some particular way. You want to read something a little more literary, or a little more violent. The the lovely thing about Fight Club actually is that it's on the speculative side. It positions itself as existing in our world, but then it imagines a world that is different from our own, however slightly or greatly, I guess, is up to you to decide. But you find somebody who really likes, I almost grabbed a book and I didn't. But you find somebody who really likes Chuck Palahniuk, and they're like, I'm sort of interested in speculative fiction. My first recommendation, if that person wants to read speculative fiction and they really like Chuck Palahniuk, is going to be Nick Harkaway. He's very easy to read. Harkaway is very easy to read. It's speculative, but also pretty well based in a world that's familiar to us. And it has the same level of like humor and not taking itself too seriously that that we want if we're trying to read leisurely. But it's also a little more literary. I don't know how to qualify that. I should definitely stop using that term, literary. But let's say, you know, because the reason I grabbed Fight Club is because it's a lot of people's intro to literature, and bless it for that. This cover is really weird. I think you can tell when the light hits it. Yeah. So, you know, if somebody comes to me and they're not much of a reader, or they want something like Fight Club but different, you know, I've got here we go. We've got Tarik Shah, who was at the Collins Writers Conference last summer. Another cool cover. Look at that. This deals more with poverty and social environments and sociology. That's really what I was going for. It's super short. It uses pretty conversational language. There's also a lot of poetry to the language in here, which sounds really weird to say. It's both conversational and poetic, but it's true. And it's super short, which makes it not intimidating, right? It still took me like a week to read. Yeah, so somebody trying to expand from Fight Club into poetry, or Fight Club into literary fiction, as opposed to contemporary, which these are both contemporary, obviously. I would give them Whiteout Conditions by Tarik Shah. Then if they really like that, that's a good segue into poetry, because Tarik Shah is also a poet. If the person is going from Fight Club, they want to read local and they're from the Midwest, which I guess Tarik Shah's book takes place in Chicago. That's the Midwest. But we had Brian Kranz on last week. So I'd say, hey, this guy used to live in Davenport or Rock Island. Or, you know, I think he grew up in Minnesota. You know, this is the sort of wild ride that Fight Club is. But it is more about mental health and coming of age and, well, or sociological. These three books are all pretty sociological now that I'm thinking about them in this context. So back to me. My goal in 2020 was to read new genres and read local, which actually all of these books fall under the outside of my comfort zone. Even though I have read all three of these books, they're not what I would ordinarily go for. For someone who is more into fiction and wants to, say, learn about, I did not grab the books I thought I did. Someone who's more into fiction or nonfiction, someone who's really into prose and wants to get into poetry. There are a few poets that are super, super accessible, and that's my primary goal, my primary like sticking point for expanding your reading horizons is accessibility. So it should be easy for you to cross over into this new area of reading. Otherwise, what's the point? If it's hard to do, you're not going to do it again, because you're not going to. I don't mean that we can't do hard things. We can do hard things. But if a book is not a good experience, meaning it's hard to read or hard to understand, then why would we continue down that road? So, okay. With that in mind, I will go clear to the other side of what I was doing. I want to read academic work And I had Philip Goldfarbstert on a couple weeks ago now, talking about his academic writing. And something really, really great about his work is that it is more conversational than most academic writing. That said, it's also a niche topic, right? If you don't specifically want to learn about Shakespeare, you're probably not going to pick that book up. Now I'm going to show you the book I want to read, and then I'm going to show you the books that I'm using as stepping stones to get there. I want to read this book by a professor I had in college, Modernism and Time Machines by Charles Tongue. And it's not easy for me to read, which is quite a bit for me to admit. He was an amazing professor. This was probably the title of the class I took with him. It was about modernism. It was a class on modernism. Modernism is a period in art history. So when somebody says something like postmodern, they're discussing the genre that came after modernism, which we titled postmodern. Right. So modernism doesn't refer to contemporary. It doesn't refer to right now. It refers to like the 20s. Back to my point. I find this book pretty hard to read. It's very academic, and because it's about literature, it's also it's very conceptual. It's not as much on tangible topics. So there are two things that I recommend. If you're like, I want to read academic work, but it's a little bit over my head. One is find an academic book on a topic you care about. I'm choosing video games for this example. I have not read this book, but I read a different book by this author, Christopher A. Paul, also a professor at the same university, but I never had him. He writes scholarly work on video games. So if you care about video games, this is a great entry point for learning how to read academic work. Plus, he's funny. His work isn't dry. It's not wholly conversational, but it's easily accessible if you if you know the topic. I don't actually know video games very well, but I care about media. Media studies is a big thing, and video games fall under that category. The other thing is, Bell Hooks is a very famous writer, and she is an academic, and she writes very conversationally, and chances are she's written on a topic that you know about or care about, both. The first book I read by her was Teaching to Transgress. I wanted to read about teaching, and her books are really, wow, I have so many notes. This book I bought used, so it already had marking in it, but my handwriting is everywhere. I know because the person before me used a highlighter and I don't do that. But she's written on every topic. And she writes very conversationally, and her books are more put together like essays rather than chapters. I don't think technically they are essays versus chapters, but they're written as such. So if you only want to do it in bite-sized chunks, you can, without feeling like you're going to forget where you were. And she writes it's so accessible, which is what's really, really amazing, and something actually that we find particularly among people who are from marginalized cultures. Bell Hooks she died very recently, but she's a Black woman. She grew up rural and poor. She's a feminist, and those are all things that made her stand on the outside of academia in particular, which I think is probably, and I mean, I think she says this, but part of her motivation in being accessible is that everyone should have access to knowledge, which is also, of course, what Philip and I talked about, that there's an amount of gatekeeping in academia that isn't necessary, but also the more into something you get, the more jargon you're going to encounter, just because that's the language of that particular culture. So you want to get into academic writing for reading for whatever reason, because you care about modernism and you want to know what your professor has to say about it, there are 2 entry points. One, find something that Bell Hooks said on something you care about. The other is find something you care about and know about and use that to stick your toes in. Now, if somebody primarily reads fiction or nonfiction, I guess these are 2 separate roads. I got to decide which one I'm going to take. If someone primarily reads nonfiction and they want to read poetry, first of all, there's poetry to match whatever topics they care about. I have, for the last couple of years probably, been giving the same book of poetry to every femme I know. It's really special, this book, because of its accessibility. Like, on the face of it, it doesn't seem accessible because there's a lot of weird formatting going on. It's not at all like the poetry we read in high school. But particularly for femmes, particularly for millennials and younger Gen Xers, this book is hyper accessible. And that's, I got a little bit off from where I was planning on going. Yeah, I've had her on the show before, and she's actually got I think a book launch tonight too. Becca Klaver's Ready for the World. This book talks a lot about growing up in as the internet grew up, growing up with, it's a coming of age poetry collection for femmes. If I were to describe it, that is how I would describe it. And it's, the reason it's so accessible is not just the content, but it's not written in such a way that, like, the words are hard. There's not so much going on that someone is not going to understand the poems. And I think for me, as someone who took her time getting to poetry, because I find it intimidating, that is really, really helpful for me. Finding a poet who I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to get it, which I will argue most poetry is more accessible than we give it credit for. But I want to show, there's some funny formatting in here, which could be pretty intimidating, but I want you to trust me that it is not. Okay, so this is about message boards, so it doesn't look like a poem so much, but it is. Also, basically, poems are what poets call them. Like, there's no specific thing that a poem has to be. Yeah, so visually, some of it can be a little intimidating, but the content and the language is not. It is very accessible. I would say, depending particularly if you're into nonfiction, but depending what topics you care about, there's going to be poetry for you. If you're into the working class story, there's Philip Levine. If you're into, I was going to say feminism, and then my mind went entirely blank. If you're into prison stories, there's, this is another local person, Carol Tix, or maybe Teeks, Tyx, wrote a book called Angola. I think it's called, well, it's wonderful. Achilles, Angola, Carol Tix. Remaking Achilles, that's what it's called. Slicing into Angola's history. So that's about Angola prison, which had a prison rebellion due to inhumane conditions. So if that's something that interests you and you're like, well, I'd like to read poetry, there's the recommendation. I would be showing these to you. I do actually have all of the poets I've mentioned on hand. but I did not grab them. If you're interested in racism, one of the best living American poets wrote a book specifically about being Black. There's a ton of that, of course, but the one I'm holding is Shane McCrae. In the language of my captor, it's accessible, and it's a lot about racism. Of course, when you want to read about something as broad as race or feminism or gender, there's tons and tons out there. One of my favorite books, which I've also given out as gifts a lot, is by a queer poet. It's a chapbook that the Midwest Writing Center Press put out. See if I can reach it. Called Get Home Safe by Elliot Sky Case, which has a lot of great conversations about gender in there. And I've given that to people who are not big on poetry either, to like queer friends who are in the process of maybe feeling less alone or working on feeling less alone. Art is the thing that makes us less alone, right? So why not give art about the thing that makes you feel alone? I mean, there's just tons. There's so many queer and feminist and anti-racist books of poetry out there. It's just stupid for me to try to think of categories because poetry exists. Again, the people to ask are going to be your librarians and your booksellers, but talk to your friends too. I have some friends who I don't love their taste. I in fact totally disagree with their taste, but you can find, if they use something like Storygraph or another, book rating system online, you can see what books you have in common and compare them. And if your friend really likes a book you hate, like maybe they're not the one to take recommendations from, but if you and your friend share similar tastes, then you can trust their recommendations, right? And the same goes for booksellers and librarians. They're going to hear what you like, and they're going to give you similar titles, but in whatever direction it is you want to go. So that's they're not going to be personally invested in you liking what they like because they're not your friend. I mean, they could be. You can make friends with booksellers all day and librarians, but your friend's going to be kind of sad if you don't like their favorite book. I cannot believe I've managed to talk this long. I am very impressed with myself. I thought this was going to be a short video. Another really cool thing for someone who wants to read outside their comfort zone, right, based on genre, it would be anthologies. The one I brought up next to me is, well, I'll just hold it up, New Moons, which is an anthology edited by Kazim Ali on Muslim life in North America. But, well, it's contemporary writing by North American Muslims, which does not mean it's about being Muslim. That's important to clarify. But what's really great about anthologies like this, I mean, choose any topic. You can also do like Best American Blank, which is a series of anthologies that are just Best American Short Stories, Best American. I saw one yesterday that was environmental writing. I didn't even know they had that. But anthologies tend to be mixed. Those wouldn't be mixed genre. So that's what this looks like. But then, well, you've got the intro, which is like an essay, really. And then here's a poem. And there's a lot of poetry in here. And here's a short story. And here's a poem. So that's something that's really cool about anthologies, which hold a special place in my heart. I read anthologies slowly, and that's fine, by the way. But for me, if something comes chopped up into pieces, it makes me feel like I'm allowed to read it in pieces. So give yourself that permission too. Pick up an anthology edited by someone you like or on a topic that you're interested in. go wild. It of course, you know, it can be, for me, one of the points of reading outside of my comfort zone is to read about things I don't know anything about. So how do I say this? I care about video games. That's why I picked up the first book about video games, but I've never played video games. It's not something I know anything about, except that I have dated people who have played video games. But it is something that is clearly very important to the culture I live in. So I decided I'm going to read that book. The book I did read by Christopher A. Paul is called The Toxic Meritocracy of Video Games. And I thought, that sounds sociological. I care about sociology. Why do gamers do what they do? What was Gamergate? What is meritocracy? And all of these questions are answered in that book. And then it talks about, you know, how to get outside of the meritocratic world, both in life and in video games. But if you're not like me and you haven't just decided you're going to learn everything you can, it helps to have easy access points, which is what I'm trying to give you. There's a nonfiction author who I recommend. I mean, there's a lot of nonfiction authors I recommend. Like I said, nonfiction has so many categories. But another few ways of getting into figuring out what to read in nonfiction if you're a fiction reader. You know, is there a column you like in the local paper? So I was just thinking, I picked up Little Village yesterday. You know, they always have book reviews and music reviews, album reviews. So if you trust the people in here, you know, you can trust their recommendations. Where, like, you know, if you are from, say, Cedar Rapids and you were used to seeing Liz Lenz as a columnist when she was a columnist at the Gazette, you know, she has books out there. If you like what she has to say, you're gonna like her books. She's a little bit funny. She's a little bit divisive, and her books are all, and she has two that are out right now, and they're pretty focused. One's called Godland. It's about religion in the Midwest, and religion and politics in the Midwest. One's called Belabored. It's about having a body that produces children. So it really, like, if you like somebody's voice, then you can get into the topics they talk about. That's another thing. Categories that were hard for me initially to get into were comics, sci-fi, fantasy. Sci-fi is easier for me than fantasy. Can't explain that. I think it might be just that my suspension of disbelief is sort of broken. And with sci-fi, I'm like, oh yes, the science gack. Where with fantasy, I'm like, okay, magic. I don't know. Neither is like better or worse. It's just the way my brain works. I had never read romance. I had never read true crime. I'd never read a thriller. I picked up a cozy mystery. The fun thing too is everything I'm listing, like I could give you a local author with who writes that thing, which is super exciting. And that stuff's also going to be available at your library or your bookstore. I would say, you know, you could get it on Libro FM or on your e-reader, but you don't have a human being to talk to in those venues, which, like, of course, use those. Audiobooks and ebooks are still books. It's just that getting recommendations is better from a human being. There are lots of fiction authors who cross into nonfiction, say as a teen, and also I read a lot of YA, so like no shade there. As a teen, you were really into John Green. He just came out with a book of nonfiction, The Anthropocene Revealed. I don't own it. For me, Joe Mino, who was at last year's Collins Writers Conference as a faculty, is one of my favorite fiction authors. He wrote a book of nonfiction called Between Everything and Nothing, The Journey of Sidhu Mohammed and Razakiel and the Quest for Asylum. So they're looking for asylum. It's a true story of two gentlemen from Africa. They're from Ghana, trying to get asylum in the US. And I'm like, well, I already know I love how Joe Mino writes, so I'll probably find it easy to read this book. Comics were traditionally really hard for me. I have trouble looking at pictures. I just want to read read the words and I forget to look at the pictures, and pictures matter a lot. So this is probably a bad recommendation. Okay, I've got 2 comics here. Where's the other one? So the first comic that someone gave me when I said that I had trouble reading comics was like a bajillion pages. Granted, it was a great recommendation. It's super easy to read. And like, how do I say this? Comics aren't as long as they look because so much of it is pictures. So it was Black Hole, which is, there was a really loud noise in my house. It's positioned in the real world with some otherworldly effects. It's about an STD that shows up physically. You can see the effects of it. And I'm really, really dumbing it down. It's a really wonderful story about social stigma and society at large. It's told really, really beautifully. But I was like, that's 1,000,000 pages. I could never do that. So if you feel the same way, I mean, do read this, it's excellent. But if you feel the same way about how long it is, another one that someone recommended to me, which I zoomed through and went out immediately and bought the next one, even though I got it at the library, is Saga. Now it's clearly fantasy. These people have wings and horns. But it's like an adventure love story. And the illustrations are freaking phenomenal. The language is really easy. But yeah, I mean, I already said like, fantasy's hard for me, so it was a surprise that one could be read. If you want to read memoir, the easiest thing there is just to find someone you care about and read their book. I will say memoirs don't follow a narrative trajectory, and every once in a while they're disappointing if you expect them to follow a narrative trajectory. Obviously, that's not a memoir. Obviously, I've been recommending Chewy Rentaria's book. He was on here with me Tuesday. We heard it when we were young. It's conversational. It's easy to read, and if you're from the Midwest, it's local. You know this story in your heart, even if you haven't read the story. If somebody's interested in, I'm going quickly because I'm like out of time and I have this huge stack of books here. Oh, so with comics, right? I want to read Sandman by Neil Gaiman. Shout out to Amber for lending this to me. But I'm intimidated by it because it's supposed to be like the best comic ever written. So I'm brushing up on my comics right now. If somebody wants to read about mental health, Matthew Quick, all of his books deal with mental health. Definitely they deal with depression, but lots of other social, economic, social ills, economic ills. That sounds weird, poverty, it's poverty. And tons of different mental health issues that people deal with all the time. He is crazy easy to read. Love the crap out of Matthew Quick. He's the author I go to when teens in particular have trouble reading. He writes just amazing YA. For romance, like I said, I just read my first romance ever in 2020. It was The Cougarette by Eliza David. She is, this author is a librarian in North Liberty. Really, really cool woman. If you want to read romance, I mean, that's my, I've read that whole series now, but that's my recommendation. There's also, Talia Hibbert writes like pop lit. So it's just really easy to read fiction that is also romance, has some explicit moments. I still haven't read true crime. I'm very afraid of it. But I have this book here it's not new. Everyone's heard of it. And if you haven't heard of it, that's okay. But it's been highly, highly recommended by literary lovers because of the language it uses. And surprise, it is not actually In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I haven't read that either because I haven't read any true crime, but it's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I thought it was fiction for a large chunk of time. It is not. I don't know what it's about, but folks who know what I like to read have highly recommended it. If you aren't ready to read nonfiction, you want to know about like generational stories in Chinese, here's another MWC Press book, Flowing Water, Falling Flowers by Shishun Collins. I hope this was useful. I talked a lot about concepts and didn't get as much into recommendations, which is obviously fine. It's much more about concept for me. It's about finding inroads into new areas of reading and how that's going to benefit us as writers and as readers. I have like 2 more points in my notes, but point is, you can probably ask around if you are really dedicated to reading new things. If your interest is in seeking out new topics in a genre you're comfortable with, that's what a lot of this was. It was a lot of examples of fiction or poetry on topics. But of course, I also talked about and hope that you will pursue reading other genres. What am I saying? Reading nonfiction if you're into fiction, reading poetry if you're into prose. Hi, baby. If you want to learn about, politics and history, all that stuff is out there in a conversational voice, in a way that you can access in a way that's going to be comfortable for you. So, oh, I don't actually have a timer. We're gonna have to watch the clock. Hi, baby. I'm going to give some updates quick on the Midwest Writing Center. Of course, Iron Pen is coming up next week. So 5 p.m. on February 25th, the prompt will go live. It's $10 to register. Everyone who registers is entered a chance to win free tuition to the Collins Writers Conference. Everyone who participates is welcome to read at the award ceremony, and everyone who places is offered publication in our literary magazine Writer's Block. Now, what Iron Pen is a 24-hour writing contest. You get the prompt at 5 p.m. on Friday, and your writing is due the next day at 5 p.m. Saturday. And you can choose your genre or choose 3 genres, fiction, poetry, or nonfiction. It's $10 to enter. And the winners will be announced March 9th, and the reading will be March 12th. It's always a really good time. I used to participate when I was not staff. It's wonderful to have sort of a low risk generative project to work on. Because we delayed the start date of our Heart Work of Writing workshop with Tanea Linder, there's still time to register for that. That is a 6-week women and femme only workshop, generative workshop on how to better mine for work and how to get to the root of what work you're interested in creating. That is $90 for members, $120 for non-members, and scholarships are available. Because now that I've got a cat here, I can't reach my calendar. We have a flash fiction workshop coming up in April. The conference, of course, is coming up in June. We are going to be starting pretty soon to take applications for the Young Emerging Writers internship. And I guess that's all I got for you. So of course, today I challenge you for 5 minutes to write outside your comfort zone. I will say, I'll write poetry. That'll be my thing. And I'm gonna give 3 topic possibilities for you. You can write just really any genre you're not familiar with, but let's also try a topic you're not comfortable with, or maybe not comfortable with. If you're gonna do poetry and you're used to writing essays like me, feel free to stick with something that like your cat. But if you want to stick to the genre you're most used to, say essays or fiction, let's try to write, if you're used to doing realistic fiction, try to write something speculative, put it in a comic book universe. If you are trying to write fiction, if you're trying to write nonfiction, you're used to writing fiction, write about your hometown. If you are trying to write prose and you're used to writing poetry, make it about the town you live in currently. And if you are writing poetry and you're used to writing prose, did I do this one already? Yeah, I said do something you're familiar with, like your cat. You don't have to write about a cat. Maybe you hate cats. But something you know about, something you care about. Maybe something you can see in this moment. That is why I said my cat. Maybe your favorite park, or a favorite park location when you were a kid. We're gonna start the timer now. I can't believe we're going over the hour. That's a first for me solo. Okay. All right, poetry about my favorite part of a playground when I was a child. Folks from the Quad Cities, I'm going to write about Rocket Park. Another good one, Pocket Change Park. That doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. That went away when I was a teenager. Keep in mind, it doesn't have to be good. This is practice. It does have to be with a working pen though. Okay, 5 minutes are up. I think you could probably tell if you were watching, I was really watching the clock because that was hard for me. I'm not comfortable with poetry. I love poetry. I'm trying to get more comfortable with poetry. So what do? I read poetry. And then I try to write it live on the internet. I wrote about Rocket Park, a park from my childhood that had a really big rocket ship slide on it. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this has been at least a little helpful in helping you navigate reading outside your comfort zone. As always, please write more light into your life.